So we're really excited to welcome Alison from CAST and Dr. Abigail Moriarty from De Montfort University. And I will also introduce myself. My name is Nicole Reid and I am the Higher Education Manager in TextHelp. So I'll be your host for today's session now that we're all good to go. And if you have any questions at all throughout, then please just write them on Twitter or in the little box on your GoToWebinar panel, which I will demonstrate in a second. And then you'll have the opportunity for a Q&A at the end once Alison and Abigail have showed their slides and talked us through all that they know on UDL. So like I said, we are active on social today. So there is at TextHelp, there is Alison Posey, and there is Abigail Moriarty, and then myself, Nicole. So if you have any questions or queries or want to tweet about the webinar that is live, then please use those Twitter handles and they will hopefully then start trending on Twitter. And just to introduce Dr. Abigail Moriarty from De Montfort University. So Abby is the Director of Teaching and Learning at BMU in the UK and is really passionate and has had great success actually with implementing UDL within the university. Abby is also the contributing author of Universal Design for Learning and Strategic Leadership, a whole university approach to inclusive practice, in the book Transforming Higher Education Through Universal Design for Learning and International Perspective. This book was actually successfully launched at an event where I first saw Abby speaking back in March this year in Dublin. So it was great to see that, and I'm looking forward, Abby, to what you have to say again today. And I have Alison. So Alison Posey is a curriculum and design specialist for CAST. CAST is a non-profit education research and development organisation that works to expand learning opportunities for all individuals through universal design for learning. Alison works with educators to integrate and apply current understandings from brain research about learning into instructional practices so that all learners are able to access, integrate and become expert learners. So I am now going to hand over to Abby and let her carry on with her slides, and I'll be controlling them. So Abby, if I'm behind in any way or you need me to do anything, just let me know. So I will hand over to yourself now and mute myself.
Hello everybody, wherever you are in the world, thank you for joining the UDL webcast today. So I'm delighted to be here to talk about Big Bang or Slow Burn for UDL. This is an innovative teaching and learning and assessment approach for all. That's great. So you can see what we're going to be looking at today is how UDL at an institutional level can influence innovative teaching, learning and assessment for all. Now, as Alison is going to go on to, is to illustrate how UDL is not just an approach for disabled students, but actually UDL is applicable to all students because it is about differentiated learning. So I'd like to start off by introducing how Universal Design for Learning was introduced on an institutional level at De Montfort University, Leicester, UK. And the rationale behind this is because of our prevalence of the differentiated learning students we have in Leicester, and we are looking forward to having an all-inclusive approach. Historically, teaching in higher education was very much based on a deficit model of having students supported in their learning by something identified as a disabled student allowance. So a disabled student allowance was basically identifying students in need of requiring additional support for their learning. So as the previous slide showed, this is a medical model for support. The disability student allowance brought in additional funds to help the student being on an equal playing field. Now, obviously, this was very identifying for the student of having not something right. So it was the disabled students needed to be fixed by the DSA allowance. So inclusivity at the time of when UDL was thought about at De Montfort University was about ensuring that we were applying our legal duty to ensuring students have an equal opportunity for their learning. So we will talk about something called the Equality Act, and universities, De Montfort University including, up until this point, was making sure that students had an equal learning. So in 2014-15, we were looking at ensuring that students would have support available to them. But that really was a deficit model. It meant that students were given extra times in assessments, or they were given handouts on different coloured papers. So if we go on to the next slide, this really does show how UDL can work inclusively. So I'm showing here that these are all the students at De Montfort University, and the students that are identified in that red ring at the moment. Previously, these were the students that were identified as disabled, and they were in receipt of the disabled student allowance. If this student didn't come to De Montfort University, that disabled student allowance would have gone to the student in a different university. So these students received additional support, as in one-to-one tuition, dyslexia support, software, computers, and for students with emotional or cognitive differences, individual mentoring. Now, this was obvious that this support was supporting these students, but actually it was the medical model. The more social model was when UDL could be applied to all of the students. So this red ring now will show you how UDL applied to all students, not just those in receipt of disability student allowance. UDL can help these students. So it doesn't matter whether they're disabled, they're from a widening participation background, they are carers, they are from lower social classes. UDL, when delivered, can benefit all of these learners. Now you'll see right on the left-hand side an outlier. Now I have to be very pragmatic and identify that UDL, even in its purest sense, will still not be able to meet the very, very complex needs of all students. So there will always be a need for additional support for these students. And as we move UDL on, we will be able to see how those students become less and less. The next picture shows you where we've come from and where we want to go to. So this is a picture from a building that is relatively close to my house. And as it shows is it has stairs up to the front door. So students that have the ability to climb those stairs can access that building. But as you see, there is some very broken looking ramps that are identified for the students that have mobility issues that are maybe in a wheelchair. So it is identifying the medical model is this is for you to make do, whereas everybody else, dare I say normal, would go up the stairs. And we're really looking at taking away this obvious approach to students who need different support than students that don't. So I want to start off with actually explaining how Universal Design for Learning has worked at De Montfort University. So we have here, and I would be the person in the purple shirt because I am very small, I'm very short. And if we look at these three individuals, and they are students at your institution, then what this is showing is that we are equally sharing out the resources amongst all of the students equally. So the person in the blue t-shirt, the tallest person, they are actually getting an additional height. They don't need to see over the fence to watch this game. Now, to me, this is a rounders game, but to my American colleagues, I think this is baseball. So my apologies if it is out of context. The person in the blue t-shirt has got that added bonus, and the only person that is actually benefiting is the student in the red t-shirt, the middle student, that now can just see over the fence. I, still in the purple t-shirt, I can't see over the fence. It's just illustrated to me that I am not seeing the game. So this is equal distribution of learning support. Whereas if we move on to the next, this is equitable. So I'm identified as a student that is most in need, and therefore taking resources from one individual to allocate to the most in need individual. Now, how can this be wrong? Because equal and equitable is supporting students in a reactive way, but actually it is identifying that I am in need. It is the medical model. And this is what we would call under the UK Equality Act as reasonable adjustments to overcome barriers to learning. So the click is going to follow shortly to illustrate that. Thank you very much. So if we go on to what UDL is, this is about anticipatory adjustment. So what have we done here? The fence has been removed. There is no need for a fence. The fence was actually the barrier. UDL is recognising that barrier and removing it. Now, we've had some really interesting discussions in the UK sector about, is the fence needed? What happens if we would make that a chain link fence? So people could see through it, height wouldn't be an issue. What about if this field is near a road or a highway and there is danger to the players of being hurt? And that kind of dialogue is great. And that is the kind of dialogue that needs to happen, because there may be a need for a fence, but there isn't an automatic assumption that that fence is needed. So I would ask you to think about your own areas and identify what are the barriers to learning to your students. Fence is an obvious barrier, but think about images, think about language that is used for students, think about how students learn and how students are best able to meet their optimum. So these are the three principles of Universal Design for Learning. And this is illustrated in the following slide that shows Universal Design for Learning as having three principal elements. The first one is about providing learners with multiple means of engaging with their learning. So this is flexible ways of learning. If you are a talk and chalk lecturer or teacher, then that is meeting a certain group of students' needs. But what about those students that have to see one, do one? The students that prefer to have a more visual learning rather than audible. So having multiple means of students engaging with the learning, whether that is through technology or whether that is through teaching skills, this enables the learner to become purposeful and motivated because their needs are being met. The second principle of UDL is providing the student with multiple means of representation to access their learning. So this is in reference to how do we provide the student with resources, whether that is pre-sessional learning or whether that is access to teaching in class, that there is multiple modes of the student to engage and access these resources. Providing a student with a handout in class is not flexible. How else can that handout be provided to the learners in advance of that session? And that is something we'll come on to later. The final element of UDL is about providing the learners with the flexible ways of demonstrating their learning. And this is about their assessments. So if we are asking a student to complete an assessment, how is that assessment linked with the student's learning outcomes? If it is an unseen exam, then why is time and unseen nature an element of their learning? If it is a competency that they need to demonstrate, then that is a suitable mode of assessment. But this is really thinking about innovative ways of students engaging with their learning to demonstrate they have learned. The fundamental difference between teaching and learning. So moving on, I want to talk about how these three principles are demonstrated in De Montfort University for staff that are preparing a UDL session or programme, or as I'd like to say, an institutional approach. So these are basically breaking down the three principles of UDL into context for the teacher. These principles can appear to be very nebulous, they can appear to be very conceptual, but actually at De Montfort University, the Universal Design for Learning champion in a particular faculty has broken these principles down to encourage teachers to engage with UDL so they can see a difference of what they need to do that impacts on their students' learning. So I think I need to go back to the very beginning and talk about how UDL has come about at De Montfort University at an institutional level. So how do you get UDL on the agenda of your institution? At De Montfort University, we went to the large-scale institutional approach, and that was based on the decision that we were identifying students with disabilities as having needs that were provided by the Disability Support Student Allowance. In 2014-15 is the government in the UK at the time made the decision to actually reevaluate the Disability Student Allowance. And what it actually said was universities are not meeting their equality duty of care, is that the Disability Student Allowance is papering over the cracks of what universities in the UK should be providing for all students. And that actually this money is making universities skirt around the key elements of inclusive learning. And therefore in 2014-15, the Disability student support element was reduced, and a lot of the funding for things like scribes for students with dyslexia, computers and assistive software for students with learning differences was removed. And therefore, universities across the sector had to identify how they were going to meet this challenge. Some universities made a very public statement in the UK and said, we will meet the difference of what the government provided students funding, we will meet that difference. So in context, De Montfort University has 20% of its students' population with declared disabilities. The UK sector average is around 7%. De Montfort University has the third highest number of students with declared disabilities in the UK. To match the deficit of the DSA, the Disability Student Allowance, following the changes from the government agenda, would equate to £5.2 million per year. At the time, the university was not in a position where they could financially meet this deficit, and this was a year-on-year expectation. So at the time, the university asked for a way forward that could overcome students with disabilities having this support, but also enabling all students to benefit. And therefore, as a Director of Teaching and Learning at the time, I became involved in the Universal Design for Learning approach. And this was not a way of targeting the 20% of students with a disability. This was going to be applied to all students at the university, and this is in excess of 20,000 students. However, you may not have that level of support in your institution to actually take this forward in a large scale. But that does not stop you as an individual practitioner or a programme leader or a practitioner or in any way of adopting the UDL principles in your own sphere. As you can see, the small scale has a snowball effect, and like-minded individuals that see the difference that UDL has on students' outcomes gather together, and that small scale often becomes larger scale to medium scale to institutional approaches. But obviously, large institutional support is crucial to have a big bang approach. This shows the maturity model of how Universal Design for Learning can be applied again to a large scale model. So as you can see right at the very beginning, this is a 5-stage maturity model that is presented by FISC and supported by CAST that show that the initial exploration of UDL often comes from a catalyst. Sometimes this is a crisis, this is sometimes an opportunity. At De Montfort University, the difference in funding for students with disabilities was the catalyst, but actually I view that as an opportunity because it was the right conversation to be having at the right time, meaning that UDL would support those students but everybody else. But the development and the maturity of UDL to have an institutional impact has to go through reiterations of development before being able to escalate from explore, prepare, integrate, which is where De Montfort University is in 2019, to be able to then scale and optimise to become sector leading. Montfort University has had national and international recognition for the work that UDL has had on the university. However, to become sector leading, what the university now needs to show is, so what? What is the difference that UDL is having on students at the university? So if we start at the project stage to show you how you can have enable you to take UDL forward. The following slide shows you how UDL was launched at De Montfort University. So first of all, 14 months to complete these 6 elements of the initial exploration of Fisker's model. I was not an expert in universal design for learning in 2015 when I was asked to take this project on. I looked at the global leaders of CASC and other authors such as Alison, who is world renowned, to be able to find the research and the evidence and the resources. So just wanted to say I didn't start off an expert in UDL, but what I did start off with is a passion for UDL. So a Universal Design for Learning project board was established with institutional buy-in. And I use what is called a principle of workstream leads, taking forward different work streams that fed back into a project board. And this diagram shows the 6 different work streams that enabled UDL to become operational at the university. So very briefly, workstream 1 identified the existing teaching and learning approaches and assessment methodologies within the institution, because plenty practitioners were actually using UDL. They might not have known it was UDL, or they might have been using UDL, but it was on an individual practitioner level. So the audit undertook every single module to be assessed against the UDL principles. And this therefore identified existing good practice, but also the areas of teaching and learning that needed to be updated, changed and modified to be UDL-able, a whole different adjective. As a consequence, we had large-scale module modifications. Workstream 2 was about embedding UDL into the psyche and the teaching practices of all of those practitioners. Workstream 1 identified the elements of people interested and passionate in UDL. So Workstream 2 developed a UDL champion job description, and people were invited to come along and apply for those. People were selected and had to demonstrate their understanding, knowledge and passion for UDL, and we successfully recruited 6 UDL champions. And they were originally sourced from the Workstream 1 audit that identified these individuals. So we have faculty, academic and professional service UDL champions. The Workstream 2 also was focusing on being able to have the dialogue with staff of what UDL meant to them, because it was a new concept for many. The third work stream was being able to see where there was barriers to UDL in particular sets of curriculum. So in the UK, we have professional statutory regulatory bodies, which you will have in the US, which basically means that certain professions have to be accredited by the statutory body as well as the university awarding the degree. So, for example, in the UK, the Nursing and Midwifery Council accredits the nursing degrees offered at De Montfort University, which provides a degree in nursing and the accreditation to work as a registered nurse. Other professions such as law, engineering, medicine, teaching have statutory regulatory bodies that indicate what a student will need to do to become an accredited practitioner. There was lots of kickback from individuals at the university that said UDL couldn't happen in their programme because their accreditation said that a student had to be taught or assessed in a particular way. De Montfort University has in excess of 40 accredited bodies. When this work stream actually drilled down into the regulatory bodies and asked for where there was barriers to be forensically scrutinised. And what we found was that professional statutory bodies did not make very, very dictatorial approaches to how students were assessed or taught. These were interpreted by universities to actually interpret them in a particular way that meant they were restrictive. So, for example, a PSRB could say students should have their knowledge examined for them to be able to demonstrate their learning. And some of our colleagues were interpreting this examination as an unseen exam. Rather than their examination of their knowledge could be achieved through, for example, a discussion, a role play, a viva, a written report, rather than an exam. The fourth work stream was the technological rollout of lecture capture. De Montfort University has mandatory lecture capture for all its staff-led teaching, or an equitable alternative that is approved. Therefore, in the first 14 months of this work stream, it was providing the infrastructure, technology, procurement of the platform and policy development to have mandatory lecture capture in 2016. Workstream 5 was ensuring that our PhD students and their supervision was equally applied to the 3 UDL principles. And finally, Workstream 6 was the development of staff training, technical training and pedagogic development for UDL. This was supported by a mandatory element for all academic staff to complete UDL training. So as you can see, in 14 months, an awful lot was achieved. But that wasn't the end of the UDL journey. And as you can see, we've started all over again to properly see the impact of UDL on the institution. So this work stream started in January 2017, and we are still at it. So this is demonstrating what is currently being undertaken at the university with a completion date of October 2020 and a transition into business as usual. So the first element here is really showing how the benefit of lecture capture had on student learning. And the first year of lecture capture at the institution showed a huge success in student engagement. And we are now just over 2 years in since its rollout, and we have clocked up over 2 million student views. And we are seeing spikes of students engaging with their lecture capture technology around assessments, and they are using this as a tool to support their learning. Workstream 2 is about trying other technological tools to see how it can enhance UDL, whether this is voting technology, auto captioning, Office 365, to see how the current and future procurement of IT at the university supports our learning. Workstream 3 is about the ongoing development of academic staff and their teaching practice. The teaching qualification that all new staff have to undertake at De Montfort University is based and has UDL running through. All of the staff development that is offered at De Montfort University has UDL as the key element. It's not a bolt-on, it's not an add-on, it is the element that underpins the pedagogy. Workstream 4 is looking at how quality enhancement at our university can be maintained. So all programmes that are validated, have periodic review or are endorsed have to demonstrate how they are going to apply UDL principles. The final element here, and that's the reason for the longevity of this work, is the so what. How has UDL impacted on student outcomes, whether that is their degree classification, their student satisfaction, or their opportunity to progress further in their study. This is the most challenging to establish because we're going to be looking at a long period of time and capturing the outcomes of several thousand students. But what I can tell you is that the UDL principles at De Montfort University has reduced the BAME attainment gap. So that is the gap between students from ethnic minorities and their white counterparts achieving a good honours degree. Historically, the university had a significant gap between these two demographics of students, and UDL has reduced this by 4% in 2 years. So, what do you need to do to get UDL on the agenda? First of all, scalability. What is your aim for UDL in your own area? De Montfort University have big bang, but that doesn't mean that you can have the slow burn and having individual practitioners making a benefit on their students' outcomes. Find your allies, get like-minded people together that find UDL fascinating as Alison and I do. Include your student body to work together in partnership. Find the levers that get senior management interested. The consequence of employing UDL at De Montfort University was the £5.2 million worth of money that would have to be invested in supporting students with disabilities. This was reduced to £100,000 per year instead of 5.2 million, a significant saving, and will often prick the ears up of senior management when engaging with UDL. League tables in the UK, student satisfaction, are all key indicators to get staff interested in UDL in large scale. It does mean investment in resources, so absorb the immediate pain. There was intensive resource investment in technology at De Montfort University, but this has had a long-term improvement on students, with the over 2 million of students using EMU Replay as a tool to support their learning. Being able to celebrate internal and external success from UDL. So De Montfort University was invited to present at various different national and international conferences. Department for Education and the Institute of Employment Studies as well as the DFE, has all come to De Montfort University to show how they can take forward our practice in their own learning. So we have had in excess of 90 universities in the UK come to us and ask how we can support them in their UDL developments. And I would say finally is this is not a pet project. Tenacity, passion, hard work and partnership is needed to take UDL forward, whether this is individual practitioners or whether this is a large-scale institutional pedagogic development. And I want to show the final slide to you to show you where and how you need to think about UDL as a tool. So first of all, as you can see from this Gladwell adoption tool, is that it takes individual innovators, people that are listening to this, to take forward and take a chance of rolling out UDL. Those innovators do get joined by friends, and they are then the early adopters. At Montfort University, these were our UDL champions. These early adopters had kudos, academic credibility with their academic colleagues, and therefore they were able to make that leap with colleagues to get over that tipping point or chasm to actually be the early majority. And as you can see, this is a large leap, but it is important that the majority do then influence those on the other side of the adoption curve, that is sometimes called the laggards or the late majority, that will only take up an approach if they see others doing the same. And I have to say, I find De Montfort University at the very top of this pinnacle now, because we have got the majority on board. But what is important is this embedding and maintaining, and the outcomes from UDL at an institutional level will have that impact of taking forward the late majority. I hope this has been useful for you and look forward to your questions at the end. I'm now handing over to Alison.
Hi, thank you so much. I learned a whole lot. And if we could advance to the next slide. Some of you may be thinking now, wait a minute, is this what I thought UDL is? And one of the challenges that we find with UDL is this large overarching framework. It's about all of teaching and all of learning. And as was noted earlier in the webinar, it's about every learner. Think of all those dots. We're really trying to get every single dot included. So UDL is not just one thing, and there's not one way that it can be implemented. So a colleague of mine shares this parable of the elephant. And basically the story goes that it's like you have a group of individuals who have never come across an elephant before, and they learn and conceptualize what the elephant is by touching it, and they're in their own little sphere. And each individual is checking out a different part of the elephant's body, but they're only in one part. Like maybe they're just on the side, or they're just with the tusk, or they're just at the tail. And so they describe the elephant based on their experience, and their descriptions of the elephant are incredibly different from each other. So the one individual who's by the tusk is saying, you know what, this is like a spear. And the individual who's back by the tail is going, oh my goodness, this is like a rope. So in our experience at CAST, and I'm inviting you to reflect on your experience with UDL. UDL can mean very many things because it's this broad framework about how we can approach teaching and learning for all individuals. So it might be that you came to UDL from assistive technologies, or to really think about access. Some of you may have come from the lens of trying to think about the crisis or the opportunity, as Abby was noting. Sometimes at CAST we call these problematunities. They're problems that have opportunities in them. So whatever brought you to UDL, you might be in that world, and then you might hear other people talking about UDL, and you might think, wow, there's really more out there. For me, I first came to UDL really thinking about the engagement principle. It was the first time that engagement was defined for me in a way that really resonated with my teaching. Engagement wasn't discussed in terms of stickers or stars or rewards, but it was discussed in terms of thinking about how we can really intentionally recruit interest, minimize threats and distractions, provide mastery-oriented feedback, invite students to self-assess and reflect. This was a deeper way of thinking about engagement and learning that immediately resonated for me. So my little sphere, my little world of UDL really revolved around engagement. But engagement is only one part of teaching and learning. It's like, you know, just being on the one part of the elephant. And this can make looking for and measuring UDL really challenging. Because, you know, how do we know if UDL is working if UDL is so many different things? So at CAST, we are wrestling, as you all are, we're wrestling with these questions. So when I get overwhelmed and thinking about the giant elephant and all the different things that UDL can mean, I start to, again, approach from my own experience. So I invite you all to think about how you have started implementing UDL. And if you haven't started implementing UDL, maybe this story will help give you some ideas for how you could get started. So I taught high school and community college science courses. And consistently, one of the most challenging, oh, we could go to the next slide, sorry. One of the most challenging parts of my teaching was our lab time. I actually thought students were very engaged in the labs, so the barrier for me was not an engagement, but it was really for me about the process and procedures of the labs. Students didn't seem to know what they were doing or why they were doing it. They weren't really understanding the connection of the lab to the content we were learning. It was almost as though my lab time was decontextualized from our classwork. Students were just kind of going through the motions. I was often exhausted after the labs. I felt like I spent a lot of time answering questions. They were often very low-level procedural questions. So this is where I pulled out the UDL guidelines. And you know, UDL is like a roadmap. And I thought, okay, how can this roadmap of teaching and learning help me out with this challenge that I'm facing in my individual classroom? So I looked at all the UDL guidelines and tried to think about, okay, which guideline is most describing this problem, this opportunity that I have in my teaching and learning. And so again, I invite you now to take a moment and think of something that might be challenging for you in your teaching. What's a point of frustration for you or for your students? So I came across the executive function guideline. It's within the blue column, the action and expression guideline. It's at the bottom, which is the bottom row is really about deep internalized learning. And I looked at the language of the UDL guideline, and it really helped me define what executive functions were. So it talks about the ability to form a goal, to build a plan, manage information, and monitor progress towards the goal. And I went, wow, yes, this is exactly what my students are wrestling with in my labs. And I knew that, you know, to kind of pull back for a minute and think about the most important concept I think that UDL gives us is this idea of variability. It's not about differentiating instruction for each individual. It's really about anticipating and proactively planning, knowing that there's going to be variability in our students. So if you take a look at this graph, you can see the tremendous range in working memory capacity that individuals have as they age. So when I'm looking at my higher ed students who are in the 18 to 22 year range, you can see that the range of working memory is tremendous. Some are going to have scores down in the 20th percentile, some are going to have scores in the 40th percentile, and this range can feel really overwhelming, but it's exactly what I was experiencing as a professor. I was seeing that there's this huge range in my students, and I didn't have to worry about a student going through disability services to be able to get some scaffolding from me. I knew that this variability was real in terms of executive function. And so I could anticipate this in the design of my labs and really help build out that design in a way that was meeting the needs of all of my students. And we say all, going for all, recognizing that it is hard to actually include absolutely everyone, but we're going for that. So I shifted framing the ability of my lab to be on the design. So the ability or disability of my lab did not reside in my students, but it resided in my design. So I started to think about how I could scaffold my lab experiences for this whole range of executive function skills. So if we go to the next slide, you can see here's the huge UDL framework, and I was thinking deeply about executive functions, which are in the bottom right-hand corner of action and expression. And so I started thinking about, all right, how can I use this UDL framework to help me think about strategies that I might use to really build out my executive function skills in my students. And I actually made just 2 changes, and they happen to be from the representation guidelines. I actually reduced the number of words on my page. If I looked at my labs, I don't know how many of you remember some of your science labs, but they tended to be filled with words. And my goal for the labs wasn't for students to decode the words on that page, but it was to get at the higher level understanding of the concepts that they could demonstrate in that lab activity. So one of the first changes that I made was I reduced the number of words on the page. I simplified the text and made the lab more like a checklist. And then I added images to align with these key steps. Now, these changes probably seem like not a big deal at all. In fact, it might have even sounded like I'm making this lab too easy. But in fact, what I found by doing these 2 simple changes, I actually tremendously increased the rigor of my lab, because students were no longer stuck trying to decode or comprehend the text. They were able to get at the goal much more clearly and monitor their progress towards that goal, those executive function skills I was going for, at a much higher level when I reduced the text and added some aligning images. And what was amazing to me was the quality of the conversations that I started to have with students about the content of the lab was much higher level. It's almost like by reducing the barriers and all of the text and the decoding that they were trying to do in the lab, they were able to see more clearly the purpose of the lab and where we were trying to go with that content. And it was magical for me. So what I started to do, and it resonates very much with what Abby was describing, was I started to share this process with my team. And I started with my science, with some of my colleagues in my science department who I thought could work with me and could help me brainstorm and strategize together. Students started to become more aware of the UDL guidelines. I started using some of the language for learning with students themselves. So when they went to other classes, they could advocate for themselves and some of the needs that they need, some of the learning needs that they had in the different classes. That brought UDL to the attention of some of the other teachers, and the snowball, again, as Abby was describing, the snowball started to grow. So the thing about the UDL guidelines, and it's a double-edged sword, the UDL guidelines give us this amazing language to think about our teaching and learning practices, but they're not prescriptive. They won't tell us exactly what to do. And that's actually an amazing thing, because as technologies and tools change and grow, so will the options and the opportunities that we incorporate into our practice. So the UDL guidelines allow us to better understand what to pay attention to in the design of our learning environments and how we can be more intentional about the options that we're providing. And ultimately, if we could go to the next slide, the truth is that unfortunately, by the time students get to higher education, they don't have all of the skills necessary for them to be expert learners. They have challenges and barriers that they still face. Maybe it's around organization or writing skills, reading or annotating for comprehension, or knowing how to have a robust discussion. These nuts and bolts skills that we need to make these skills explicit and really scaffold students to learn them. Because if we don't scaffold these skills, when will they get them? So UDL is going to give us this common language to use to think about learning and to think about our design. It's going to help us create a buffet of learning opportunities So then we can differentiate and work with students to meet the needs that they have to get to our high-level, challenging, rigorous goals. So I invite you to take any one of your practices. Start small, start with a single lecture, or maybe start with how you offer office hours, or how you support students to properly learn how to cite their research articles. Take something really small and think about what the high-level goal or skill is. What are you really trying to get students to know, do, or care about? And then offer students a couple of different pathways for how they can get there. And I'm telling you, the changes that you make will likely be very small. Recently, I just started adding sentence starters into my online discussion course, and the quality of responses dramatically changed. So take your syllabus, look at the amount of text, break it down into tables, chunk it, add images, highlight the key ideas, invite students into the conversation around what the course will mean to them, why the course is important to them. And you can use these UDL guidelines as this amazing tool to really help you get new ideas about different supports and different strategies that you might start to include in the design of your particular course. And then the fun begins. Then you can really start to share out among other people in your university. You can start to think about different data and what's happening in your classroom, what's happening in terms of student learning. Gather that data and share that out with others, because that's where the exciting change starts to happen. And so if we could go to the next slide. Ultimately, UDL is about this mindset. It's a shift in thinking where we're not thinking about students as having ability or disability, but we're thinking about how our environments are disabling. How can we design the learning environment to enable learning? And again, those UDL guidelines, it's just a tool, it's a roadmap to help us think about how we can get our students there. And my colleague, Dr. Schlickman, gave an amazing definition. When we enable students, we make them able, but we also give them power. And we're really, with UDL, thinking about empowering learning for all students through flexible means that they'll then be able to take and make their own. So UDL may seem like simple nuts and bolts. It may seem like, just good practices that we've had, that we've always used, and they are. But UDL is giving us a new organization for thinking about those practices. And importantly, UDL is giving us a common language to use across our universities about teaching and learning. And that allows us to really deepen our understanding and our opportunities for our students. So I want to thank you for sharing, allowing us to share today. And I want to echo what my colleague Abby noted, that let this start with your passion. Really think about what excites you, what drives you in your practice each day, and let UDL help you really teach and be that educator that really speaks to your passions. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. That was really insightful. I am going to get on to some questions in a second, but just to say from my perspective, thank you again, and it was a really excellent deep dive into the practical side and the theory of UDL. I am by no means an expert, so I learned a lot as well from that, so thank you. And I'll certainly be taking away some ideas in order to feed back to the development of what we do and produce here at TextHub. As a key aspect of our products, as I'm sure you're aware, is the design and functionality which is built around the UDL principles and those guidelines that were mentioned. I think UDL is so broad, and for anyone exploring it for the first time today, having those basic examples in there is really relative. And from my perspective, I look at UDL in relation to assistive technology, but actually it's important to note that sometimes the everyday changes impact everyone, especially when you see images like the one Abby used of the ramp, which is poorly constructed. I actually use a similar image, but actually one that is an example of good practice of UDL, which is in Robson Square in Vancouver, if anyone has ever been lucky enough to go. And it's a really good example of how UDL can be embraced to ensure accessibility for all, not just those with a disability, which I think is often a misconception around the topic. So I am just going to jump over. There were some questions that came in throughout the webinar there, but just a question from me. And this one's for you, Alison. Are there any tools or other resources you would recommend to support the application of any of the guidelines?
This is, there are so many. And what we encourage folks to do is really start with one guideline. We've had schools just focus, for example, on thinking about options for perception for an entire year. That's how many possible resources could align to one of these guidelines. So each guideline, you know, there are really endless options. The critical thing to do is not to think about the tools. I know that may seem counterintuitive, but the critical thing to think about is, what is your goal or purpose? When you know the goal, then you're able to think about how to include different options or different technologies in intentional ways. So just asking for a tool, I can't just give you that because I don't know your goal. I don't know your purpose. So if you want to talk about, you know, I'm hoping to get students to, like the example that I gave you, you know, be more strategic in the way that they progress monitor through their labs, then we can start looking at tools to really start to brainstorm different resources that will help set the buffet, the learning buffet for your students to be able to use towards that goal. So I invite you all not just to think about tools or strategies, but to really think about first, I guess the most important tool I'll say is first think about your goal, think about the purpose, the objective, and know that, and that will be probably the best resource for implementing UDL that you'll ever find.
Thank you so much. Another question then we had was, I think you'll probably both be able to answer this, but I was wondering, what role do you think technology has to play when it comes to supporting the UDL guidelines, and can the UDL guidelines be meaningfully implemented without modern technology? So I'm not sure who wants to.
Go ahead, Abby.
Oh, sorry. So from my perspective, is technology is a tool to enable UDL rather than a deliverable. And very small changes to teaching practice can really enhance the student experience, and that doesn't need to have technology. However, through my experience of using lecture capture and so on, it has been able to see how technology can give students more opportunities to engage with their learning as they see fit, rather than a teacher or lecturer dictating when that should be. You can have a vast array of technology, but have very poor teaching practice, and that means that UDL is being completely ignored.
Thank you.
Absolutely, I would echo all of that. Technology provides incredible opportunity, there's no doubt. But thinking even about something like a pencil grip can have revolutionary impact for some students. So really, sky's the limit in terms of how we define technology, and really thinking broadly about how we can use different tools and resources to really help students be able to achieve the intended learning goals in flexible ways.
Thank you, that's great. Just one final question that's come in, and that is, how can UDL be effectively applied in blended learning?
Well, my view is that blended learning is the best platform for UDL because of the opportunities to construct the learning in a flexible way. So I make reference to a very technical term called the cheese sandwich, which is indicating that the opportunities for the students to engage with their learning, their subject matter before their session, their program, their lecture. Then the cheese is the actual delivery of the session. And again, that can be virtual or face-to-face. And then the most important bit is the consolidation. So how does that bring the learning together within all of the course and the program? And what blended learning can allow the student to do is to eat that sandwich in whatever way they want to. So they may not do pre-sessional research, reading, quizzes, or testing. They may just go straight to the cheese and then come back to the pre-sessional bit to actually get contact with that learning. And really blended learning does allow the student to dip in and out as they see fit, which does make some academics really anxious, because they often want students to go through the linear and logical way of their learning, and blended learning allows for that flexibility.
Absolutely, and we want to think about how students gain their necessary background, how students can engage in the content, and how can they show what they know. And blended learning is just one piece of thinking about how there are different opportunities for each of those within our different settings.
Thank you both so much. So there is no other questions that have come in, but I'm sure there's lots more and people have a lot to think about after the webinar. And just a final thank you very much to Alison and Abby for your participation today. And I know there was a lot of preparation that went into this, so really appreciate all of that and your time, of course, as well. If anyone does have any further questions, just pop them over to us either on Twitter or via email, and we will be able to coordinate with Abby and Alison and get back to you with those. Don't forget the webinar was recorded, and the slides will be made available along with the recording, and you'll have access to those on Monday. So everyone will get a copy of those along with any resources that were mentioned during the webinar. Also, a special thank you to Judith from ClearText for the excellent captions that we had provided today. We really, really appreciate it, and we hope that everyone finds those useful. So as there's no other questions, I'm going to draw the webinar to a close, and a final thank you very much to everyone who presented and of course all those who attended and took the time to join us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for hosting.